Hello, I'm Virgil Schmidt, Extension Field Agronomist in far eastern and southeastern Iowa. Today's presentation reflects the impact of low commodity prices combined with input costs that are remaining relatively high. This is causing many farmers to ask, what production expenses can I avoid while having little or no negative effect on yield? One area that many people are examining is their soil fertility plan. In this presentation, my objectives are that when we're done, you will be able to look at a soil test report and be able to confirm that the classification of soil test levels, very low, low, optimum, high, or very high, has been done correctly. And if the laboratory made any soil fertility recommendations, that those have also been done correctly. And then moving into our current situation, what adjustments are appropriate given the situation that we're in with the low commodity prices and relatively high input costs? To get there, the topics that I plan to cover are, first of all, a good soil sample, and then how do we categorize those results? How do we make the recommendations for phosphorus, potassium, and lime? And then what adjustments are appropriate in our current scenario here? Just from kind of a big picture standpoint, soil testing itself does not tell us how much phosphorus or potassium is in the soil. It provides us an index that tells us the odds of getting a positive return on investment if I apply fertilizer, and then appropriate amounts to apply if fertilizer is needed here. So with that as background, we'll begin, I think, by taking a little bit of a look at good soil samples. This publication, Take a Good Soil Sample to Help Make Good Fertilizer Decisions, can be downloaded from the resource list that is on your field notes. This gets into the weeds of how to take a good soil sample. If you did not take your own, be sure that the person that has taken or will take your soil samples is very familiar with the contents. Now, if we go through the 4 pages of this, it basically narrows down to 5 concepts. One is that the sample being cored, or from which the cores are taken, should be a fairly uniform area. Should have similar soil types, similar topography, similar background, et cetera, et cetera. We want a minimum of 10 cores per sample. 12 to 15 is better, and if we've done some banding, such as banded fertilizer, starter fertilizers, and so forth, we want more. We don't want accidentally hitting or missing that band too often to skew those results. Samples should be taken from a depth of 6 inches. Shallower or deeper sampling will skew the results. With relatively high fertilizer prices, we recommend taking a new set of samples every 2 years. And when that sample is taken, it should go to a certified by the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship soil testing laboratory. Now, what does it mean if the laboratory is certified? Basically, it means they do good chemistry. It does not mean that they properly classify soil test results. Some labs do, some labs don't. Nor does it guarantee that fertilizer recommendations are good. Some labs don't make recommendations. Some labs make recommendations that are spot on, and others make recommendations that are just out there a little ways. Now, the list of certified labs is listed in the resource area of your field notes. So go there, find, I think it's the 3rd bullet down, and click on that, and you can find what the certified labs are. So once we get our results back, we need to be sure that the laboratory has categorized them right so that we can make an appropriate recommendation for fertilizer application. The Iowa Soil Fertility Bible, so to speak, is PM 1688, and you're going to see me refer to this many times. A general guide for crop nutrient and limestone recommendations in Iowa. And the link to this publication is also in the resources list on your field notes. If you dig into it a little bit, tables 3 through 14 basically tell us how soil tests are categorized, and then provides us some suggestions for amount of fertilizer to apply, if any is needed. There's a different table for each crop, and there is also a table for multiple crops, such as the corn-soybean rotation. We're going to be focusing on table 3, which is assuming that your next crop is going to be corn. But if your next crop is going to be soybeans, you would use table 4. And if you are going to be fertilizing for a corn-soybean rotation, so 2 years of fertilizer, you would be using table 5 here. Now, one of the things to point out is that the recommendations, and I'm going to kind of hit recommendations and back out and go back to categories and then go back to recommendations again. But the recommendations for the optimum testing category is to fertilize for crop removal. The other thing I would point out is that, they always say the devil's in the details. It's hidden in the fine print. Read the fine print, read the footnotes. There is important information underneath each of those tables. So if I go back to PM 1688 and look at table 2, I will see something that looks like this. And this is probably too small for you to see on the screen unless you're up really close and dirty. So I'll kind of walk you through the first line, which is corn. And what that basically says is for the corn crop, for a bushel of corn at 15% moisture, it removes 0.32 pounds of P2O5 and 0.22 pounds of K2O. So if I have 200 bushel corn, that's 64 pounds of P2O5 and 44 pounds of K2O. Now we're at table 3, and as I indicated earlier, this is the one I'm going to use as an example. Recognize that tables 4 and 5, 4 for soybeans, 5 for a corn-soy rotation, work exactly the same way. There are a few different numbers on there, but it works exactly the same way. So if we look at table 3, one of the things we will notice is that there are actually 4 different tests for phosphorus from which the laboratories can choose. There's the Bray P1, the Mehlich 3P, the Olson P, and the Mehlich 3 ICP. If you look at the categories off on the right-hand side, one of the things that you will notice here is that these numbers are a little different depending upon which test we use. The Bray P1 and the Mehlich 3 throw basically the same numbers, but one of the things you'll notice is that the Olson throws smaller numbers or lower numbers, and the Mehlich ICP throws higher numbers. So which test is best? They're all excellent tests. They just throw out different numbers. And so it's important to be sure that you know what was used by the laboratory so you know what row to look at in determining what your soil test category is. If I go down to the potassium, I also see that there are 2 different tests that can be done. Those are the ammonium acetate and the Mehlich 3 extractable K. And those throw exactly the same numbers. But there is a difference if the laboratory runs the sample dry or if it runs it field moist or slurry. They're all good tests. But as you can see, the field moist slurry throws lower numbers than the dry. Now, I said they're all good tests, and they are, but there is good data that the field moist method actually will throw more consistent numbers for you in poorly drained soils. So here we have a soil test. I have redacted a lot of the personal information and professional information there to protect both the guilty and the innocent. And if you pull your bifocals up real tight and look, you'll see there are a lot of numbers there. I'm going to focus on this group of numbers because these are the ones that are important. The rest of the numbers really aren't important to us at all. And so I'm going to pull that up. And here we see, first of all, organic matter. And it is at 3.1% organic matter, and then it gives a classification of M for medium. I don't know of any classification system for organic matter. So that's basically some idea that somebody had. The 3.1 becomes important if we're selecting herbicides, because some will have different rates depending upon what the organic matter level is. So pay attention to the level, but don't pay attention to any classification that's on there. And then we can see that here we did the Bray P1 test, and here they did the ammonium acetate test on the potassium, and they classified both as medium. Now, the medium classification disappeared over 30 years ago, but some laboratories still use it. And so if you see an M for medium, that should make your eyebrows go up just a little bit, and make sure that you want to dig into that just a little bit more deeply here. There is also a result for the strong Bray, the Bray P2. There's no calibration for that, so that's one of those things that it's an interesting number, but that's all it is. It really doesn't mean anything to us whatsoever. So we've got this as background. And so let's see how these soil tests really should be classified. We see that the Bray P1 phosphorus is 20. And so I will go over here and I see my Bray P1, and I go over here. 20 falls in the 18 to 25 range. And so that tells me my soil test for phosphorus is optimum. So I go back to my soil test, I cross out the M, and I put an O for optimum in instead. And then I move to the potassium. The potassium is 148. So I go back to table 3. I know that this lab only does the dry test, so I know which line to be on. And I move across here, and 148 is in the range here between 128 and 170. So that tells me that this soil test is in the low category for potassium. So I go back to my soil test, I cross out my M, and I put an L then for low. So I know my soil is testing optimum for phosphorus and low for potassium. Now, with that little bit of information, we start to make a potassium and a phosphorus recommendation. And again, we go back to table 3. We said that the Bray P1 was a 20, which is optimum. And so the table says to put on 67 pounds of phosphorus, P2O5. But notice at the bottom here, this is crop removal for 210 pounds. Remember when I said 200 before? That would be 64 pounds, and so forth and so on, okay? And so this number here would need to be adjusted for the yields that you are taking off of that field. The potassium we said was 148, which we said was in the low category. And so if I go down to the bottom here, it tells me I should put on 110 pounds of K2O. What about lime? On the soil test, this says our lime is at 6.8. Now, what should it be? If you go back to page 12 of PM 1688, you will see this graphic. And basically what it says is that for the southeast two-thirds of Iowa, we should shoot for a pH of 6.5 minimum for corn and soybean production. And in the northwest, about a third of the state, 6.0 is adequate here. Well, we're at 6.8. And so we don't need to make any adjustments to pH. And you might notice that what they call the buffer index here is blank. And that's basically because we don't need to add any lime. Buffer index. If I go to table 16 in PM 1688, we'll see this. And it's kind of daunting. There are a lot of small numbers in here. But one of the things you'll notice over here is what's called the buffer pH. The difference between pH and buffer pH. pH is what the soil nutrient sense. It's what the plant senses. That tells us whether or not we need to add lime. If the answer is yes, we need to add lime, then they take a prescribed amount of your soil and put it in a prescribed amount of a buffering compound, and then they measure how much that soil lowered the pH of that buffering compound. The more it lowered the pH of that buffering compound, the more lime you have to apply. And so the pH tells us whether or not we need to apply lime. The buffered pH tells us how much. And so the how much is over here. And yeah, this is pretty convoluted, but if we sift through it, we basically need to know two things. One is, how deep am I going to neutralize? If I am looking at a no-till situation, it's probably 2 inches. If I'm looking at something like a field cultivation, field finishing, vertical tillage, it's probably 3. If I'm looking at some deeper tillage, it's probably 6. And then we have to ask ourselves, okay, now that I know how deep I'm going to neutralize, do I want to bring that to a pH of 6, as in Northwest Iowa, 6.5 as in Southeast Iowa, or 6.9 if I'm talking about alfalfa? And so I figure out which column I want to be in, and then I go down until I get to the row where my buffer pH is, and that tells me how much I need to put on. Now, as you look at this graph, one of the things you may notice is that when we get into the lower right-hand corner here, we get some very substantial amounts, over 2.5 tons. And we probably don't want to go there, and I'll kind of give you an idea of why here in just a minute here. So with that, we know how we do it in normal times. How do we do it in times of low commodity prices? So I'm going to kind of do this in reverse order. I started out by talking about phosphorus and potassium, and then I moved to lime. We just talked about lime, so I'm going to start with making adjustments to lime, and then I'm going to wrap up with phosphorus and potassium here. This is true statewide. If the pH of your soil is 5.8 or higher, probably the best course of action at this point is to postpone any lime applications. There is a very low chance of a positive return on investment in the next year or two, given the low commodity prices and any yield bump you might get. Now, we'd like to bring the pH up higher long-term, multiple years, but if we're looking at just the near term, then probably just staying at 5.8 or above is the better course of action here. If our pH is below 5.8, we want to apply lime. And we want to apply lime at the prescribed amount, but not more than the 2.5 tons. We don't want to put on that amount that was on the lower right of that red line on the last slide. And the reason basically is that 2.5 tons is going to give you all the yield response you're going to get, even on the most acid soils. And so you may as well just put that amount on and then retest again in 2 years. For both of these strategies, we want to retest in 2 years. What about phosphorus and potassium? If soil test levels are very low, apply the recommended amount, even if you're renting. There's about an 80% chance that you're going to get a nice yield response. It is extremely likely you're going to get a short-term positive return on investment, and usually that positive return on investment is very substantial. So for the very low testing soils, put it on. For the low testing soils, apply the recommended amount or as close to that as cash will allow or as you can justify. Making a fertilizer application to low testing soils gives you about a 55% chance of a yield response. A short-term positive return on investment is probable, and it may be substantial. Now, if you cannot because of cash or you cannot because you cannot justify it in your own mind, put all of that on the low testing soils. Put on what you can afford or what you can adjust. Evenly distribute that over all of the low testing soils. If you put a little bit of fertilizer everywhere, it's much more likely that you're going to get a positive return on investment than if you put the full load on some of that land and then leave nothing on the other part of that land. Once we get to optimum, remember now, optimum in the long term is where we want to be for maximum profit. But if we're looking at a short-term return on investment, we have only about a 25% chance of getting a yield response in the next year or two, and the chance of a positive return on investment is less. So with the low commodity prices, it's probably the better part of valor to not make applications to optimum testing soils, and then put the fertilizer back on when the commodity prices have improved. For soils testing high or very high, the chances of a yield response, a positive yield response, is very low, and so we recommend not putting any fertilizer on. And again, as always, resample in 2 years here. So what we have done in the last few minutes is we've talked about the importance of a good soil sample, how soil tests are categorized, how phosphorus, potassium, and lime recommendations are made in normal times, and then what adjustments to make to phosphorus, potassium, and lime applications in times of low commodity prices. We said that we needed to start with a good soil sample. We need to make any adjustments to soil test categories as listed on the soil test report. If pH is less than 5.8, make a lime application, but not anything over 2.5 tons. Otherwise, apply no lime. Apply recommended rates of phosphorus and potassium fertilizers to areas testing very low. If possible, apply some or all recommended phosphorus and potassium fertilizers to areas testing low. Postpone fertilizer applications to areas testing optimum, and avoid making applications to areas that are testing high or very high, and again, retest in 2 years here. At the beginning of the presentation, I indicated that my objectives were that when we were done, you would be able to take a soil test report and make or confirm the categorization and the recommendations for phosphorus, potassium, and lime in normal times, and that you would then be able to make adjustments to reflect our times with low commodity prices. If you would like to discuss these concepts earlier, there is a large group of us around the state, field agronomists around the state here. I'm in the lower right-hand corner of Iowa, and you can see my counterparts in the other parts of the state. You will notice the white counties in south central Iowa have no arrows pointing to them. As I make this recording, that position is vacant. Hopefully by the time you view this, that position is filled. If it's not, the rest of us will sag in and cover that for you. If you have any questions, contact your local county extension office and ask for the contact information for your field agronomist. And with that, thank you for your attention. I hope you found this information to be useful as you make a foray into 2025. And I wish you a prosperous 2025. Thank you very much.